the main focus for today is I'm kind of expanding upon a subcategory of a workshop that I did a few weeks ago, where I kind of went over the the core workings of the solvers. And so today I want to focus on understanding the fuzzy logic part, because every solver is always working in a fuzzy logic manner. Even though sometimes it doesn't look like it, but it always is, and there's a way to kind of give the appearance that that fuzzy logic is turned off, but it is just an appearance. So so let me kind of get myself ready for this first example. And so I'm going to start with something simple before I actually go into this question that I was asked. So what I'm going to be getting to is this question here, which is, I may have a CCI needing to be above the 0 line for, say, 3 bars, but it may dip below 0 by 2 or 3 points once, and I don't want that to invalidate the signal. So, so this is kind of a perfect example of BloodHound's fuzzy logic component. That's really kind of is one of the major strengths of BloodHound, right? So so while we people look at the chart and make decisions, we could look at seeing the CCI, breaking the 0 line, but we could use our own not intuition, but just use our own cognitive ability, to allow an exception for certain things, because we know that the markets don't move in perfect movements, and so therefore when we see stuff in the chart, we give it leniency when certain rules are kind of broken minorly. And so how do you kind of translate that into BloodHound? And that's what BloodHound's fuzzy logic component allows for, is for your rules to get bent or broken slightly, and still get a trade signal. So before I kind of get into this advanced question here, I want to step back and kind of explain how the fuzzy logic works. And I think once this is understood, it makes using the rest of the solvers far more easier to do once this is comprehended. So I'm going to start first with I took some screenshots and drew on them to help explain how the fuzzy logic works. And let's see, I don't want to start with that one. Alright, I want to start with this one here. So what I've done is, we're using the threshold solver. So we can see we have the threshold section here. And once again, I'm just using the stochastics because it's a very simple indicator that just it's range bound between 0 and 100, and so therefore it makes a pretty simple translation from the thresholds to the output to BloodHound's output. Right, so we can see in the thresholds what I'm looking for is I'm comparing, or I'm not comparing, but I'm looking for a threshold of 100 to 0. Right, so this threshold section pertains to the indicator value of 100 to 0, as noted by the arrows. And then every solver, or not every, but most of the solvers have an output section. every solver does have an output section, and a few of the solvers, have very detailed parameters within the output section. So back to our thresholds here. So we can see, right, so we're analyzing the stochastics in its range from 100 to 0, or we could say from 0 to 100. And we have set our output, our long output. Right, I'm just focusing on the longs only here, just to make it a little easier to understand. And so we can see on the output here, when we're at 100 or greater, we want the solver to output a value of 1, or another way of saying that is 100% confidence. So when our stochastic indicator here reaches the threshold level of 100, BloodHound will give us back a 100% confidence that the indicator has reached that threshold of 100. And then when the stochastics gets down to 0, then this solver will give us a 0% confidence met. And so we can see as the green stochastic line, as it fluctuates from it looks like it's around 10 here, and as it moves up and gets closer to 100, we can see BloodHound's output is also matching it. So the closer that our stochastic indicator gets to 100, the more the output increases to 100%, as specified on the long output section. So what the solver is doing is it's looking at the stochastics value, and it's creating a percentage between 0 and 100. So as a simple example, like right here at the 50 line. So if the stochastic is at 50, well, 50 is halfway between 0 and 100. Right? So that's 50%. So 50% of our confidence has been met. And so it's going to take that 50% and then take a look at the output section, and it's going to calculate what is 50% between 0 and 1. That's 0.5. Right? 0.5 is the halfway. So if the stochastic is at 50, that's halfway between 0 and 100. And so therefore it takes the output from 0 to 1 and calculates the halfway point, which is 0.5. And so we can see it. If we look down the line right here, BloodHound's output right here on this bar is basically at 0.5. So BloodHound, right, so each solver is always doing this interpolation on all the solvers. So it's looking at, so for the threshold solver, it's looking at, where is the stochastics value in between two of these thresholds, and then calculates a percentage of where it is between the two thresholds, and then takes that percentage and multiplies it by whatever output settings are set. So that's kind of how it is in a nutshell. Let me move on to the next section. So here's where we have the shorts only. And in this case, we're using the short output, but this time you can see the outputs are flipped. So when the indicator is at 100, when the stochastic is at 100, we want a 0% confidence from the solver on the short side. And then when the stochastics gets to 0, we want a 100% confidence out of the solver. And so we can see here, as the stochastics, the green line, gets closer to 0, we can see that the output gets closer to 100%. And it's actually displayed as -1. But just think of it as 100% confidence for the short side. And then we just translate it into a negative, so that way it displays, that way it gives an easy to understand visual display. Right? Longs are in the positive and shorts are in the negative. But still, BloodHound is taking its value. So once again, you know, if we use when the stochastic is at the 50% line here, you know, if the stochastic is at 50, BloodHound comes back over to the thresholds and says, you know, where does 50 lie between 100 and 0? Well, it's 50% between these two values. And then it looks at the short output and says, what's the output between 0 and 1? Well, that's 0.5 again. And as we come down this bar right here, where the stochastic is at 50, if we look across, the output is -0.5. And if you know, if we take a look at this high point here on the stochastic, right, it's at approximately 90. And so where does 90 lie within here? All right, so it's going to take that percentage of 90 between 100 and 0 and apply that 90 percentage to the output, which is of 0 to 1. And since we're really close, since 90 is really close to 100, when the indicator gets to 100, our output is 0. So therefore, the output gets closer and closer to 0. So I hope this kind of explains the ratio that every solver is trying to calculate, and how it applies the ratio to the output section. And that's how these outputs get calculated. Alright, so now on to kind of what the question was. So the question was that, you see, how do we allow for now, so this is the CCI indicator now. So I've switched over to the CCI indicator to answer this question here that was posed. So the question basically is, how do we still allow for like a long confidence even when the CCI breaks below the 0 line? So we can see the CCI is at -4.5. Right? I'll just round it off. So it's at -4.5. So it's below the 0 line. But you know, if we saw, you know, if we saw the CCI just breaking the 0 line, but then bounce back up, you know, we may not necessarily, if we were trading this discretionarily, you know, we wouldn't necessarily say to ourselves, well, it broke the 0 line by just a tad, I'm not going to take the trade, you know, because we know that the price action is very random and your indicators don't always perform exactly. So, you know, so we always allow for the rules to get bent a little bit. And so how do we get the computer to allow the rules to be bent slightly? Well, that's where BloodHound's fuzzy logic comes into play. So once again, we'll take a look at these thresholds and how the outputs correlate to them. So we can see, right, on our thresholds, I have 50, right, and 50, and then 0, and then I put -50 and -50 again. And So on this particular point right here, where we're at -4.5. Well, so we're just below the 0 line. Now if we look at how the outputs are structured, we can see that this part is probably pretty easy to understand, pretty intuitive. So that when the CCI is at 50 or greater, we want a long output because the CCI indicator is above 0. So we want 100% confidence. And once again, when it's just at 50, we want 100% confidence. Or when the CCI is at 0, we want 100% confidence. All right, so the way these outputs are structured, anytime the CCI is at 0 or above it, right, we're going to get 100% confidence output. And of course we can see, just by looking at BloodHound's output, right, whenever the CCI is above the 0 line, we're getting all these long outputs. Now, the fuzzy logic part comes into play where we can see at 0 to -50, down to -50, there's a difference in our output. So our output will go from a 100% confidence to 0% confidence. Right? So there's this area here from 0 to -50 that can be interpolated from 1 or 100% to 0%. And so that's what BloodHound is doing. So as we dip below the 0 line, we're at -4.5. So from the 0 line to right here where it's -50, BloodHound is going to start calculating this ratio of where the CCI is between 0 and -50. Right? BloodHound's going to calculate that ratio and apply that ratio to the output. Right? And so the output varies from 1 to 0. And so we can see that the solver's output dipped down to basically 91% as the indicator broke below the 0 line. So by specifying a threshold of 0 and then another threshold of -50, and then changing our output from 1 down to 0, it allows BloodHound to apply a ratio of where the indicator is between 0 and -50 to the output of 1 to 0. And we can see here on this bar there's an output of here about 0.45, something like that. And if we look up, luckily we happen to have a grid line here. So the CCI is, I don't know, at about -35, right? It's just above -40. So yeah, it's at about -35 or -30, and so if you calculate that ratio from 0 to about -35 to -50, that ratio is right at about 45%, and that's what the output here is. The output is at about 0.45 or 45%. So that's how that works. So I think next I'll move over to the chart and kind of show it on the chart here. Now, so I've got the stochastic, the threshold with the stochastic indicator selected, and you can see I've got my thresholds in here, and there's no outputs. Right, so just remember the threshold solver is the one solver that doesn't have any default outputs predefined. So you do have to go in here and specify an output that you want. So if I put a 1 in here, basically that's going to mimic the screenshot that I just showed you. And as you would expect, right, BloodHound's output is just going to match the stochastic indicator, right? So the closer the stochastic indicator gets to 0, the closer the output's going to get to 0 because of, right, basically our threshold of 0 and our output at 0 is 0. So, and then let's see, I guess, yeah, just to kind of expand upon this, one part that I didn't cover on the screenshots is, right, typically you're going to also want a short output as well. So we'll just take one side at a time. So let me set this to 1. And oh, sorry. I need to work up here. And I need to slide the scaling up. There we go. And you'll notice that, right, when I made that mistake just now, when I set this out to 1, you're thinking, well, at 0 or less, I want a 1, and that should work. Well, this is kind of pointing out how BloodHound is interpolating the threshold values and creating a ratio to the output values. So if we look at D and E, it's basically from 0 to 0. So BloodHound is going to be calculating a ratio from 0 to 0 of where the indicator is, and then applying that ratio to this output. Right, and our output is 0 to 1. And of course, no ratio can be calculated when your thresholds are set from 0 to 0. And so since no ratio can be calculated, this output's not going to do anything. Basically, this output would only work if the stochastic got to 0. So the stochastic would have to get below this threshold, the D threshold, before it could interpolate to an output of 1, which this output here correlates to threshold E. So the indicator would have to get below this threshold before it could start calculating a ratio to start applying to the outputs. And let's see if that actually happens. I wonder. I kind of doubt that's ever going to happen. Usually when you're like on a Renko bar or a range bar, it's pretty rare for the stochastic to max itself out at 100 or 0. Yeah, it doesn't ever happen. So, oh, wait, look at that. There we go. So there. So our stochastic did actually get down to 0 for a couple of bars. And therefore we did actually get an output. So let's see what happens if I put a 1 here. So really no change, because once again C is 0 and D is 0. So once again, they're really from 0 to 0. There is no values to create a ratio from. Right. So this, remember, this at 0 is correlating to C. So let me put a 1 in here. So we're correlating from C to B, right? And C to B is still 0 to 0, and there's still no change. But now if we put a 1 here, which this output correlates to B, So if I put a 1 there, now we actually have some values that BloodHound can create a ratio from. Right? So now BloodHound can create a ratio from 100 to 0, and then apply that ratio from 0 to 1. All right. So where do I want to go from here? I guess let me. And so really, these aren't really necessary. I mean, you can leave them in there. It's not going to hurt anything, but I'll set them all to 0 just to really point out that they're really not necessary. Oh, look at that. Except one of them is, oh, we do need this one. There we go. So we at least need the at 0 or less in there. Alright, so now let me kind of show, let's see, I have to turn the fixed scaling off. And if I set a long output to 1 here at 100, so there, now we can see that the longs versus the shorts creates, you know, a perfect kind of balance here. Kind of a it's not a mirror, but essentially the length of this output bar from the short output to the long output is always going to be 1, a value of 1. That's kind of what's getting created here. All right, let me take a look at the questions and see if you guys are stunned or or if you guys got it. Let's see. And so Ray is just commenting that he also has gone back to some of the NinjaTrader training videos just to think of it as your professional continuing education. So poor Bob, suffering with 100-degree weather in California. Man. Yeah, it gets up to 100 here in Idaho, but it's a, quote, dry heat. So somehow that makes it better, right? Being a dry heat, well, actually, it does. I mean, if you've ever been to Florida or Washington, D.C., man, that humidity will kill you. At 80 degrees, that humidity will kill you. All right. And let's see. All right. Good. So, Randy's got a nice 70 degrees in Colorado Springs. Very nice. All right. Good. So, I take it this is kind of making sense to you guys. So, with that kind of basic, excuse me, with that basic explanation, then we'll move on to the main question of the CCI and allowing it to dip below the 0 line here. So let's let me let me reorganize my indicators. All right. Alright, so this time I added short outputs here. just because this area here, basically we're dealing with the CCI below the zero line. Right, so we can see we have the zero line here, right here in the middle. And for the most part, the CCI is kind of below the zero line. So we'll kind of look at these as the indicator breaks above the zero line. So, so we can see on the short output here. So let me I'll remove the long outputs. So that way we just focus on the shorts here. So right now our CCI is at -35, so we're definitely below the zero line. And we can see our output here is at -1, or 100% confidence to the short side, or 100% confidence that we are below the zero line. So let's step forward one. And the next one here, we break above the zero line at 2, right? 2.7. We'll just round this off to 2.7. And we can see our output to the short side begins to diminish. So now our output is at basically 95%. I'll just round this 0.947 off to 95%. So what BloodHound's doing is it's looking at these two thresholds, and it's calculating a ratio. So it's going from 0, the zero line, up to +50, because that's where our indicator lies right now. Our indicator lies between 0 and +50. Right? It's calculating that ratio and applying the ratio to these two outputs right here. It's applying the ratio of 0 to 1. When we're at 0, we have a 1, and when we get to +50, we get closer and closer to 0. So it's applying this ratio, and therefore our output to the short side begins to diminish. And if we step forward one more, right, so the CCI now gets up to 8.7, and our output here begins to diminish even more, down to 83% to round it off. Step forward once again. Right, let me just step forward a bunch more times. There we go. So here, look at it. Oh, perfect. So our CCI now is at almost 25. You know, if I round this off, our output is at 25 if I round it up. And for the CCI is at 25 if I round it up. Our output is at 50%. If I round it off, the output here is at 50%. So it's kind of a perfect example. So you take the indicator at 25, so 25, you know, as a ratio between 0 and 50, 25 is, right, 50% in between these two values. So you take 50% and multiply it by our outputs from 1 to 0, and there we go. There's our output is at 50%. Now, so the next step is kind of how do you control the outputs scaling, right? How do you control the outputs scaling, right, based on the ratio here that BloodHound is calculating, right? BloodHound's calculating this ratio between 0 and 50 and between 0 and -50. Well, it's an easy. Essentially, you just change the numbers of B and D in this case. So you change the number between 0 and 50. So if I put 10 in here, now you can see BloodHound's output goes to 0. Quite simply because our CCI indicator is at 25, right? So it's above 10. So now BloodHound is calculating a ratio from 10 to 50. right? Our indicator is now in this area of 10 to 50. So it's calculating that ratio between 10 and 50, and then it's looking at our output, and our output is from 0 to 0, so therefore there's a 0% output confidence. So now if I change this to, say, 30, so with our indicator at 25, the solver is now calculating a ratio between 0 and 30, right, and applying that ratio to our output of 1 to 0. And since 25 is very close to 30, or very close to an output of 0, you can see our output here is at 17 or 18%. 18%. And if I increase this number, right, which is changing the ratio, you'll see that the output keeps increasing. So if I set this, see what happens if I set this to 60. It does work, and let's see. Yeah, since we're only looking at the shorts, you can't see the complications that this would create, but on the long side, if we were looking at the long output, this would create some complications. So just always remember to put your highest values in A and count down. So let me set this to 100. Alright, so now let's get back to looking at the short output. So I increased the range from 60 to 0, and when I did that, the output increased to 59%. And if I change this to 70, right, the output keeps increasing. And it's because the ratio from 0 to this value keeps increasing. As our indicators, it's fixed at 25 here. So this is how I can control how much I want to allow an indicator to break the 0 line and retain like a long output or a short output. So if I set this to 100, you can see, so now the output is at 75%, right, which is almost enough to get a signal since our threshold is set at 80%. So if I keep increasing this, let me mark this up to 200, and if I increase this to 150, so now our ratio from 0 to 150 is 84%. And so now I just allowed the CCI to cross the 0 line all the way up to 25 and still get a short signal out on this situation. Alright, I'm just going to set this back, reset that, and alright, yeah, let me turn the long sides on here. And let's see, let's slide this forward here. And so we can see here, I made a mistake in my long outputs. And so we can see here, the CCI is at 30. But if you look at the long output, so let's look at the longs only here. So if we look at the long output, it's, so the CCI is above 0, but the long output dropped to 60%. Why is that? Well, our CCI is at 30. So where's BloodHound calculating this ratio, it's calculating it between B and C, right? So 0 and 50. And if we look at our output, so when we're at 50, we get a 1, but when we're at 0, we want a 0% output. So the closer our indicator gets to 0, the long output's going to be 0. So I forgot to put a 1 here. So we put a 1 there. Now we're getting the expected output. So we have so CCI is above 0 line, and we get a 100% output on the confidence. So now let me step forward. Okay, CCI dips down to -4, and you can see the output, the long side output, starts dropping off to 91% confidence. We'll step forward again. Nope. And yep, and so the CCI drops below 100, so of course there's no long output there. Let's see, let me try and find some good spots here. All right, here we go. So, all right, once again, the CCI dips down to -9, essentially, to round it up. Our output dips to 82%. So it's allowing this dip below the 0 line to still give us a long confidence, or a long signal. And then when we get down to essentially 17, if we round this off, that's 66%, and that doesn't qualify for a long signal. All right, let me turn both of these on, and we can just take a look at how this all works. There. Yeah, so as we look at this section here where the CCI is kind of fluctuating around the 0 line, we can see how the long and the short outputs fluctuate here. So, all right, I think that kind of wraps that up. All right. So let me move on to the next question, which is I was asked about 2 different stop ideas. So oh yeah, I'm glad to see that I actually got several people now submitting questions for these Friday workshops. So that's great. That's great. I know I'm not answering all of them. But I'm glad to receive all of them. So essentially I just kind of pick out the ones that typically I haven't covered in a while, or if someone submits a question that seems to be a very common question. A lot of people get hung up on those. You know, those are kind of some of the deciding factors of how I pick which questions I'll show in the workshop. Kind of what I feel will be the benefit to most of you guys out there. And all right, so this stop loss here. So this question was essentially, you know, how do you kind of create an exit logic for Raven? And so we want to create one exit logic where we're stopped out at the highest of the last 3 bars for a short entry. So let's work on that. I'm going to minimize those guys. And turn all the solver's off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put SI Chameleon on the chart, because the way this was asked was the last 3 bars. So we want to get stopped out at the highest of the last 3 bars. And Chameleon can do that. So it does have some functionality other than just passing price, let's see, bar price values to BloodHound. It does actually have some functionality that can be useful. And I'll demonstrate this for you. So with Chameleon, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the look back to 3, and let's see, I want the highs and the lows to be plotted, and I'm going to make this a little easier to see, so I'll put this green, and also I'm going to change the plot style to hash. And let's increase the thickness. And let's see. Yeah, let's see. The midpoint, I'm going to set that to transparent. And I think there's another. Yeah, there we go. The opening price is set to beige, so I'm going to set that to transparent. Alright, typical, and the weighted is off. Okay, set to transparent. Great. I'm going to hit apply. And so, what's happening here? You can see I didn't put a name on this template yet, so I didn't name my BloodHound template. So, BloodHound is just asking, do I want to name it? Because if I hit no, it's not saving this work to a file yet. But for now, I'm just going to hit no, and I'll go back and put a name on it in just a moment here. All right. So now, we can see. I'll just change this to 1, just to kind of back up a little bit, and hit apply. So we can see with the look back of 1, it's just the current bars, highs and lows are being marked. So we can see, right, the high point being marked by green, the low point being marked by red here. Now if I set the look back to 3, hit apply. So we can see for the high points here, BloodHound is holding on to the highest price of the last 3 bars. And then it drops down to this being the highest value of the last 3 bars, right, and so forth. And the same with the lows. This point right here of the last 3 bars is the lowest point of the last 3 bars, right, and so forth. So we can use Chameleon to check to see if price, breaks the high of the last 3 bars. And as you can see, so as let's see, right here is a good example. Actually, no. I'll look for example for the short entry here. Let me find it. Let's see. This might be easier to find if I set this maybe to 4. Okay, yeah, great. So setting it to 4 made it a little easier to see, and I need to draw on the chart. So what I'm interested is this right here. So we can see right here, this high point is being marked. And of course, as soon as price breaks this high point that's being marked, of course, this bar that broke it made a new high. So Chameleon marked, this bar's high. It changed the high point to match the bar that broke the previous high. So when we set up this situation of looking for price breaking the last 3 bars high, we have to look back 1 bar. So we'll have to let me move this over. So we'll take the current bar's high price and compare it to Chameleon's high price 1 bar back. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. And I think this example might work better on a minute chart. Probably will. Let's see here. Yeah. All right. So right in here. This is making more sense right in here. So we can see, like on this bar here is kind of a great example. We'll go with this. So we can see we had the high point here, and then this bar broke it and moved Chameleon's high point up. So we'll have to check the high price of the current bar compared to the high of the previous bar. Right, let's see. Alright, let me bring up BloodHound, and let me give this a name. So, alright, there's today's date. So now we just need to decide, which one of these solvers do I want to use. Well, what I'm doing is I'm looking at, let me move this forward. So we'll say, right, this is the current bar. So I'm looking at this bar's high, and I want to compare it to the previous bar's SI Chameleon high. And before I go too far, let me actually set this back to 3 so we match the question asked exactly. Okay, there we go. So we're comparing the current bar's high to the previous high marked by SI Chameleon. So we're going to use a comparison solver. And let's see. What do I call this? How about a 3-bar high, low break. All right. Let's see. The next step is I'm going to be comparing the high and the low of the current bar to the previous bar's SI Chameleon high and low marker. So let me get the high and low price for indicator A section. So I'll change this over to Chameleon. And let's see, the way the rules are, so if we're short and the high price of the current bar breaks the high marked one bar back, then essentially we want to exit a short, and that happens. So to exit a short, we want a long signal out. We want the opposite. So we want a long signal when we're from the highs, and from the lows we want a short signal. So for the opposite, so if we're long, if our market position is long and price comes back and breaks the previous 3-bar low, then we want to exit that long position by using a short signal. So we want a short signal out of the low price. Now you notice that for this one, I'm leaving the look back to 1 because I'm only interested in the current bar's high and low price. Now, for indicator B, set that also to Chameleon. This time, I want to use Chameleon's look back feature, so that way Chameleon is holding on to the last 3 bars high and low price, as we can see on the chart. And once again, I'm going to use the highs for a long output and use the lows for a short output. And let's see if I got that correct. And you're going to go, oh, look, no output. Something must be wrong. Well, remember, we have to take the current bar's high and compare it back 1 bar. Because as we can see, Chameleon's high, as marked by the green line, matches, of the current bar, matches the bar's high. So I need to compare it 1 bar back. So I need to use the displacement of 1. And there we go. So as this high broke the previous high, we got this long output. And the shorts here, so we can see on these 2 shorts, so as the low price kept stepping down, it constantly was breaking the previous 3 bars low point. And so therefore we get a short confidence output. So this is it in a nutshell. So that's question 1 answered. Not too complicated, but it's a good question because it gets you to think about how you approach such a question. And also it might provide some new uses for SI Chameleon in your system. Knowing now that Chameleon can hold on to the the low of last X bars, and it can hold on to the high of last X bars. Alright, so let's go into the next question here. Alright, stopped out using the SI swing high-low indicator, where a short is stopped out as it crosses beyond the nearest swing high. So it's the same thing as the first question, except we're just using a different indicator, so it'll give us slightly different results, since we're going to be using an indicator to track the high and low points. Alright, so let me rearrange the indicators on the chart. And let's see, what do I want? I'm going to just put these in the background here. And I'll put the SI swing high-low on the chart. Alright, and I'll just use the default settings here. And I think really probably what we're interested in is just the lowest low being tracked by the indicator and the highest high being tracked. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn the tightest outputs off. So I'll set them to transparent. And what we want to see on the chart and what we're going to use in the solver is the widest plot values here. And let's see, bottoms, I'm going to change the colors. Let's see. Yeah. Alright, make them a little thicker and change the plot style. Well, I'm already using hash. I like to use hash, but I'm already using that, so I will go to square. Yeah, there we go. I'll make this really obvious. Let's use a let's use an up triangle for the bottoms. Yeah, and I'll use a down triangle for the tops. Alright, there, that should be pretty obvious to see. I'll brighten the red up a little bit. Never was a fan of that pink. I'll just change it to red. Alright. Just a sec, I'm going to check my indicator again. And okay, great. So we can see that the SI swings high-low, right? It's holding on to this low point here, the lowest low, and then as price moves up, it generates this well, ultimately what, if we're looking at this in real time, we get this high point right here, and as we step forward, what needs to happen is a recent low point needs to be generated before this really becomes a high point, the highest high point. And now we can see the indicators marking this high point here. So what we want to know is when does price, so say like part of our system somehow caught this and said, okay, we want to go short right here. So how do we detect when this previous high point was broken? And we can see that it's being marked here. So Well, I can see that the way this indicator is working right now, this doesn't work as a great real-life example because the problem is price broke this high point before the indicator actually picked it up. And that's because the low point was created right 1 bar previously. So price made a low point 1 bar prior to price moving up and breaking that high. So it's not a good example. Let me see if I can find another example here. Sometimes the toughest part can be getting your indicators set so they kind of behave exactly the way you want them to. Okay, here. Yeah, here we go. So here, we'll use this section right here. So we can see this high point is being detected by the indicator, and it's being marked. And we have the high of the bar breaking it. So essentially, there's not going to be much difference. Actually, I don't think there's going to be any difference in how we have this previous comparison solver set up. Essentially, we're just going to be swapping out the indicator in section B here. So I'm just going to copy this solver, and so this is not a 3 bar anymore. This is really the swing high-low break. So I'll rename that, and I'll change the indicator. And now the tricky part is to figure out which of these plots do we want to use. So once again, if we go short in this area, we want to exit that short with a long signal when price breaks the indicator's high plot. So we want a long signal when price breaks the indicator's high. So for the whitest tops, right, so the triangle down is our whitest tops plot, and we want a long when we break it. And when we break the whitest bottoms, we want a short. So let's just change that, and voila. Oh, here, let me turn something on. To make the screenshots, I had turned the racing stripes. I had turned the racing stripes off. So there, this is what you guys are used to seeing. All right. And I'm going to change the Z order on this indicator so it shows through. There. And so, great. Here we can see as our high of the bar, the high price, broke the previous bars, or broke the previous bars indicator high. Remember, I still have the displacement set to 1. So we have to look back 1 bar on this indicator. So as we look back 1 bar on this indicator, we are actually comparing. Let's see, let me mark it. So we're kind of comparing this. Oops. What's going on? There we go. So we're comparing that to this. So this is what we're comparing, is these two price values. And let's see if it's kind of hard to see these triangles. Let me make these triangles even bigger again. Let's see. 7 ought to do it. Yeah, there we go. Great. Okay, so now to kind of take a look at the lows here. So as the low price here, I'll mark it with a diamond. So as this low price, so we're comparing this low to the indicator's low plot of 1 bar back, which is right there. And as soon as we break below it, we get a short output. So there's 2 different ways of detecting when price breaks you know, a previous high point, whether it be a simple high of so many bars back using using SI Chameleon, or you could use an indicator like you could use NinjaTrader swing indicator if you wanted, right? Or you can use this high swings high, the SI swings high, highs lows. It's kind of tough to say. All right. So that's that. They're both essentially the same. Just one's using an indicator, and well, they're both using an indicator. All right. Well, with that, that kind of wraps up what I had for you guys today. Let me see. I do see there's one question in here. Ari, I think I'm pronouncing your name right, I hope. Ari, could you explain how SI swings high, low works before proceeding? Essentially, Ari, SI swings highs, low does kind of the same thing as NinjaTrader's swing indicator. So if you're familiar with NinjaTrader swing indicator, it works essentially the same. There are, where to go? Where is it? There we go. So I'll just plop that on there. And yeah, so there's the dots from the SI swing indicator. You know, they're essentially the same. There's some slight mathematical differences in there. In calculating when, let me turn my fixed scaling off. So there's some slight differences in how the high points are calculated between the two indicators. So there are some previous workshops where I do go in and kind of explain how that indicator works in depth. Probably the best workshop to watch is the workshop where I discuss, let's see, which workshop is it? I believe it would be the swing trend. Yeah, I think it's the workshop explaining the swing trend. that'll give you more detail on how that indicator works. So, all right. Let's see. All right. Let's see. Bart has popped in here with a question. Let's see. All right. So Zach, I'm having problems with getting any output from better momentum indicator. It's based on volume, and its values are varying a lot. Could you advise on how can I simply check if the indicator is going to cooperate with BloodHound or not? Well, yeah, Bart. So I put together a tips and tricks video to help you to show various ways that you could test an indicator out to see if essentially what it does is it determines if the indicator's output is what's called public or private. So in programming language, it's either public or private. And a lot of third-party vendors choose to make the output private so that you can't use it in the system. For some reason, they feel they need to hide the output of their indicator so you can't use it in a strategy, or you can't use it in another indicator. They're afraid that if you backtest it, I guess they're afraid if you backtest it, you'll find it's not working as promised by some by some authors, and so they intentionally will disable the output from being readable by any other indicator. So, all right, but so Bart, let's see. If we go to BloodHound and learn BloodHound, and then there's a tips and tricks section here. So let me pull this up, and if we scroll down a ways, let's see. Here we go. So on June of last year, well, almost a year ago, I put together this video here, how to analyze custom indicators in BloodHound. Custom indicators or third-party indicators, it's the same thing. So this video will kind of show you various ways, to test your third-party indicators to see if it'll work in BloodHound. All right, guys. With that, I'll wrap it up. It's 12 o'clock. So have a great weekend, and I hope you guys stay cool. Talk to you later, or see you next week.